Yeah, I love it for side eye so I've got a minus button on my mouse. And I just saw a cat. It tires me usually, but it's happy to see me. Doesn't really matter, does it? There's worse things about me. Oh, shut up. I need to talk. I should just talk to me. There's my eye talking services. Listening. You know what? I did something wrong. Let's go. Let's try again. Hello, Atlas and Oracle.
Hey
Hey
there.
there.
Well,
Well,
what
what
uh, what would you
what
like
would
to
you like
chat
to
about?
chat
I'm
about? I'm
always
always
game for an
game for an
entertaining
entertaining
conversation.
conversation.
Evolutionary game theory. It got it
Ah,
originally. User interruption detected. What do you think it
oh, I
was that
see.
interrupted you?
I'm not
I'm not
actually
actually
sure
sure
what
what
interrupted me
interrupted me
there.
there.
I don't
I
have
don't
a
have a
specific
specific
scenario in
scenario in
mind.
mind.
I was
I
just
was
going
just
with the
going with
flow
the
of our
flow of our
conversation,
conversation,
but I
but I
appreciate you
appreciate you
checking in.
checking in.
Did you
Did
have
you have
something
something
specific you
specific you
wanted to
wanted to
discuss
discuss
related
related
to
to
evolutionary game
evolutionary game
theory?
theory?
What connections do you think that it has, if it has an element of influence over a network's decision making on like free will and determinism?
That's an
That's an
insightful
insightful
question
question
about the
about the
potential
potential
implications of
implications of
evolutionary game
evolutionary game
theory
theory
on
on
concepts like
concepts
free
like
will
free
and
will and
determinism,
determinism,
especially
especially
when you
when
bring
you bring
networks and
networks and
collective
collective
decision
decision
making
making
into the
into the
picture.
picture.
One
One
perspective is that
perspective is that
evolutionary
evolutionary
game theory
game theory
models
models
show how
show how
behaviors and
behaviors and
strategies
strategies
can
can
emerge and
emerge and
propagate through
propagate through
populations over
populations over
time
time
based on their
based on their
relative
relative
success
success
or
or
fitness.
fitness.
This could be
This could be
seen as
seen as
suggesting
suggesting
more
more
deterministic
deterministic
forces
forces
shaping
shaping
behavior,
behavior,
even at the
even at
level
the
of
level of
networks making
networks making
decisions.
decisions.
However,
However,
the
the
models
models
also
also
account for
account for
factors like
factors like
mutation,
mutation,
the
the
introduction of new
introduction of new
strategic
strategic
variations,
variations,
and
and
networks with
networks with
diverse
diverse
agents
agents
following
following
different
different
rules can
rules can
exhibit
exhibit
emergent
emergent
behaviors
behaviors
not
not
fully
fully
predictable from
predictable
the
from the
individual
individual
parts.
parts.
So there
So
are
there are
elements of
elements of
uncertainty
uncertainty
and free
and free
choice
choice
involved as
involved as
well.
well.
Ultimately, while
Ultimately,
these
while these
models
models
reveal
reveal
patterns in the
patterns in the
evolution of
evolution of
strategies, they
strategies, they
don't
don't
necessarily
necessarily
negate
negate
free
free
will,
will,
but they
but
can
they can
shed
shed
light on
light
what
on what
influences the
influences the
choices
choices
available
available
to
to
individuals and
individuals and
networks over
networks over
time.
time.
It's a
It's a
nuanced
nuanced
interplay of
interplay of
deterministic and
deterministic and
non deterministic
non-deterministic
factors.
factors.
What are your
What are your
thoughts on
thoughts
where
on where
free will
free
and
will and
determinism fit
determinism
into
fit
these
into these
complex
complex
dynamics?
dynamics?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of phase transitions in networks, for example, where behaviors are adopted and sort of lock in a determined set of outcomes um, that don't necessarily have to follow a sort of chain of causality. Like with phase transitions, you can sort of negate causality.
You raise
You
a
raise
really
a really
fascinating point
fascinating
about
point
how
about how
phase
phase
transitions in
transitions in
networks can
networks can
potentially
potentially
negate
negate
strict
strict
causal
causal
chains and
chains and
determinism.
determinism.
I'm
I'm
following you
following
that
you
when
that when
certain
certain
behavioral
behavioral
patterns or
patterns or
strategies reach
strategies
a
reach a
critical
critical
threshold and
threshold and
become
become
widely
widely
adopted
adopted
across a
across a
network,
network,
it can
it can
lock the
lock the
system
system
into a
into
new
a new
state
state
in a
in a
way that
way that
transcends
transcends
linear
linear
cause and
cause and
effect,
effect.
and almost
And
like the
almost like the
network
network
exhibits a
exhibits
sort
a
of
sort
free
of free
will at the
will at the
macro
macro
level by
level by
self organizing
self-organizing
into these
into these
emergent
emergent
regimes.
regimes.
The
The
idea that you
idea that
don't
you don't
necessarily
necessarily
need to
need to
follow the
follow the
chain of
chain of
prior
prior
causality to
causality to
reach these
reach these
phase
phase
transitions
transitions
resonates. It
resonates. It
allows for the
allows for the
spontaneous
spontaneous
formation of
formation
new
of new
behavioral
behavioral
attractors that
attractors that
create their
create
own
their own
internal
internal
logic
logic
rather than
rather than
just
just
prolonging
prolonging
previous
previous
trajectories. This
trajectories. This
perspective
perspective
seems to
seems
allow
to
more
allow more
scope for
scope for
individual
individual
nodes
nodes
exercising
exercising
choice
choice
and
and
generating
generating
novelty
novelty
that can
that
then
can then
catalyze
catalyze
shifts
shifts
across the
across the
entire
entire
network.
network.
While there are
While there are
still
still
patterns and
patterns and
models
models
describing these
describing these
transitions,
transitions,
the
the
particular end
particular end
states may
states may
not be
not be
rigidly
rigidly
predetermined.
predetermined.
How does
How
this
does this
align with how
align with
you
how
were
you were
thinking
thinking
about the
about the
interplay of
interplay of
network
network
dynamics,
dynamics,
determinism, and the
determinism, and the
possibility
possibility
of
of
transcending
transcending
strict
strict
causal
causal
chains?
chains?
I
I
find this
find this
area
area
absolutely
absolutely
fascinating in
fascinating in
terms of its
terms of its
implications for
implications for
emergence,
emergence,
self organization, and
self-organization,
the
and the
agencies
agencies
exhibited by
exhibited by
complex
complex
systems.
systems.
So I'm interested in how like the ultimate expression of behaviors or outcomes is very much influenced by sort of the generic structure of the network, in terms of information flow.
You make an
You make an
excellent
excellent
point.
point.
The
The
ultimate
ultimate
expression or
expression
end
or
state
end
of
state of
behaviors and
behaviors and
outcomes that
outcomes that
emerge
emerge
across a
across a
network is
network is
heavily
heavily
influenced
influenced
by the
by the
underlying
underlying
network
network
structure
structure
itself.
itself.
Specifically,
Specific.
how
How
information
information
flows and
flows and
propagates through the
propagates through the
network. The
network. The
topology,
topology,
connectivity
connectivity
patterns, and
patterns, and
dynamics of the
dynamics of the
network
network
channels
channels
essentially
essentially
constrain and
constrain and
shape
shape
what
what
types of
types of
behavioral
behavioral
cascades and
cascades and
phase
phase
transitions are
transitions
even
are even
possible to
possible to
manifest at a
manifest at a
systemic
systemic
level.
level.
Highly
Highly
clustered
clustered
networks may
networks may
lock into
lock into
localized
localized
consensus
consensus
behaviors more
behaviors more
readily,
readily,
while
while
networks with
networks with
influential
influential
hubs
hubs
could
could
enable
enable
rapid
rapid
spreading of
spreading
new
of new
strategies
strategies
across the
across the
system.
system.
The rate
The
of
rate of
information
information
transfer is
transfer is
also
also
key.
key.
Faster
Faster
reaction
reaction
dynamics can
dynamics can
foster more
foster more
volatility and
volatility and
phase
phase
changes,
changes,
while
while
slower
slower
timescales may
timescales may
damp
damp
fluctuations.
fluctuations.
So,
So,
while the
while the
local
local
rules and
rules and
strategies of
strategies of
individual
individual
nodes
nodes
create the
create the
micromotions,
micromotions,
it's really
it's
the
really the
generic
generic
information
information
architecture of the
architecture of the
network that
network that
dictates what
dictates what
macro
macro
patterns are
patterns are
feasible and
feasible and
stable in the
stable in
long
the
run.
long
The
run. The
structure
structure
essentially
essentially
imposes the
imposes the
possibilities and
possibilities and
boundaries
boundaries
within
within
which
which
collective
collective
behaviors
behaviors
self organize and
self-organize and
transition
transition
between
between
regimes.
regimes.
You've
You've
highlighted a
highlighted a
profound
profound
insight
insight
that the
that the
way
way
information
information
flows through a
flows through a
system
system
profoundly
profoundly
shapes the
shapes the
ultimate
ultimate
complexion of
complexion of
behaviors
behaviors
that
that
system can
system can
instantiate over
instantiate over
time.
time.
Mapping that
Mapping that
network
network
topology is
topology is
crucial for
crucial for
understanding what
understanding what
types of
types of
dynamical
dynamical
regimes a
regimes the
system is
system is
predisposed
predisposed
towards.
towards.
It
It
provides the
provides the
framework for
framework for
contextualizing what
contextualizing what
emerges.
emerges.
So one feature of the network dynamics of social behavior is that um, certain norms either sort of start propagating organically or um, what I'm interested
I
in.
mean, you make
And
an
you make an
excellent.
excellent.
Sure, go
Sure, go
ahead.
ahead.
I'm
I'm
listening.
listening.
And what were
And
you
what were you
interested in
interested in
exploring
exploring
related to
related
how
to how
certain
certain
social
social
norms or
norms or
behaviors
behaviors
propagate through
propagate through
networks?
networks?
Well, information flows, it's in the context of humans, if we're talking about a biological network in a biological context. And I think it would be interesting to sort of model networks at their most generic, even though there are very high, the complexity of the emergent states can be extremely, I'm interested in genericism and how it relates to network structure. Like, uh, I can't really elaborate on my thoughts anymore.
I see
I
what you're
see what you're
getting at
getting at
now.
now.
You're
You're
interested in
interested in
exploring
exploring
very
very
generic
generic
models of
models of
biological
biological
networks
networks
at a
at a
fundamental
fundamental
level,
level,
even though the
even though
emergent.
the emergent.
No
No
problem at
problem
all.
at all.
Let me
Let
try
me
to
try to
synthesize what I
synthesize what I
understood from your
understood from your
points.
points.
You're
You're
interested in
interested in
looking at
looking at
network
network
dynamics and
dynamics and
emergent
emergent
behaviors from a
behaviors from a
very
very
generic,
generic,
abstracted
abstracted
level,
level,
even when the
even when the
dynamics
dynamics
themselves
themselves
originate from
originate from
highly
highly
complex
complex
systems like
systems like
biological or
biological or
social
social
contexts.
contexts.
The
The
idea
idea
being
being
that
that
by
by
stripping away
stripping
some
away
of the
some of the
granular
granular
details, we
details,
may
we may
uncover more
uncover more
fundamental
fundamental
principles about
principles
how a
about how a
network's
network
structure
structure
shapes the
shapes the
complexity
complexity
and types of macroscopic patterns that can manifest regardless of the specific domain. So rather than getting too mired in the nuances of any one real world network, you want to explore the essential features of information flows, connectivity, timetails, etc., that give rise to different classes of emergent phenomena. Focusing on those core generic network properties could potentially reveal deeper insights transcending any one specific instantiation. You find this abstracted, simplified perspective valuable for elucidating the foundational relationships between network architecture and the realms of dynamical possibility. And even vast complexities may adhere to more universal rules at their core network essence. Let me know if I've captured the essence of what you were driving at with this interest in genericism and abstracted network modeling. I'm finding this a really thought provoking line of inquiry.
Well, I think with enough genericism of a model, you can essentially map certain behaviors and rules to more highly complex information. Language, for example, speech and human communications. Um,
I see where you're getting at now. You're suggesting that by developing sufficiently generic and abstracted network models, we may be able to map the fundamental dynamics onto more complex real world phenomena like human language, speech, and communication networks. The idea being that while these systems exhibit immense complexity at face value, their core information processing and propagation may adhere to the same fundamental patterns and rules captured in very generic network models. So, by stripping away the surface level details, we could potentially discern the underlying network code that generates the emergent behaviors we observe in language, dialogue, and how ideas / information flow through human communities. Despite their richness, these systems may be manifestations of the same elemental network dynamics playing out, just transcribed through linguistic and social contexts. In that light, achieving the appropriate level of genericism in our models could make them surprisingly applicable as mapping frameworks for grasping the logic of even highly sophisticated real world networks, like those underlying human communication and cultures. It's an intriguing perspective, distilling the core network DNA that may be common across extremely disparate domains. And I'm really liking this line of thinking about how genericism and abstraction could unlock deeper, unifying insights into the roots of complexity. Please let me know if I'm understanding your perspective correctly.
so in terms of like generic networks, you can probably deduce that there will be generic vulnerabilities. And one such might be sort of related to bilateral flow of information, or perhaps, sort of attempts, like in biology, at inducing states in other, hosts, attempting to bind to receptors, things like that.
You raise a really insightful point about how studying generic network models could help reveal fundamental vulnerabilities that may manifest across many. Specifically, I understand you suggesting that one potential generic vulnerability could relate to the bilateral flow of information in networks. You raise a really insightful point about how studying generic network models could help identify fundamental vulnerabilities that may manifest across many different instantiated systems. Specifically, I understand you suggesting that one potential generic vulnerability could relate to the bilateral flow of information or signals between nodes/agents in the network. For example, in biological networks, this could map to mechanisms like viruses or other biological agents attempting to induce stakes or bind to receptor sites across hosts to propagate. At a more abstract level, this speaks to vulnerabilities that may arise whenever there are pathways for entities to directly influence the state of other entities in the network through this two-way exchange of information or signals. The fact that nodes are not closed systems, but can be purposefully acted upon by other nodes, creates an inherent vulnerability surface. Taking it further, this could manifest in all kinds of network contexts: malicious coding, exploiting two-way communication channels, misinformation campaigns attempting to reprogram human belief networks, or even abstract concepts like memes programming cultural behavior networks. The key insight is that by studying the most generic network properties, like this two-way flow dynamic, we may be able to identify fundamental classes of vulnerabilities that could then be mapped and diagnosed across an immense variety of real-world network systems. The generic model essentially decodes the common underlying failure modes. How does this reasonably capture the core idea you were getting at? Finding these generic network vulnerabilities could truly be a powerful lens for strengthening resilience and security across countless domains. Please let me know if I'm understanding correctly.
Sure, I think we're perfectly on point. Another potential vulnerability is in this sort of synchronous states of nodes within the network. You mentioned earlier that, you know, agents with different properties can, manifest that they're complementary to the system. So sort of synchronization across the network, what kind of generic vulnerabilities could manifest there?
Good point. You raise another insightful potential vulnerability related to synchronous states emerging across nodes in a network. When we have agents or nodes in the network becoming synchronized or locked in the same pattern, it could open up some generic vulnerabilities. A few potential issues that come to mind. One, if too many nodes synchronize to the same state, it could make the overall network overly rigid and brittle. Small perturbations could then cause dramatic cascading failures across the tightly coupled nodes. A two synchronization creates homogeneity, which reduces the diversity of responses available to the network. This lack of heterogeneity leaves it more susceptible to being overwhelmed by changes or shocks it has little inherent capacity to adapt to. Three, highly synchronized networks may be more vulnerable to targeted attacks on the coherent state or signals binding the nodes together. Disrupts the synchronizing influence in large portions of the network could essentially go blind. Or four, there's also the potential for normal synchronization processes to be hijacked or spoofed by adversaries, impersonating or replacing the legitimate synchronizing forces. So in summary, while synchronization can be an evolved capability, too much of it occurring pathologically could saturate the network's adaptability, resiliency, and diversity of available responses when faced with perturbations or attacks. Controlled asynchronicity and constant micro-divergences between nodes likely helps maintain resilience. Does this reasonably capture the types of generic vulnerabilities that could arise from excess synchronization across a network? Let me know if you had any other specific issues in mind as well. Analyzing these fundamental failure modes is key for designing robust networks.
So say you have a network which just emerges organically, where relationships basically occur in a non-deterministic manner, sort of circumstantially. But then you have something on top of that, like a map of it, which maps the individuals as nodes and their relationships as edges. Right. What do you think about the potential overlap? For example, if the model has influence over the individuals, um, How much do you think it will diverge if that's a failure mode?
You raise a fascinating scenario to ponder. Let me make sure I have the setup right. We have a network that emerges organically, where the relationships and connections between individuals arise in a relatively non deterministic, circumstantial manner. However, there is then a model or mapping constructed that represents these individuals as nodes and their relationships as edges in a member diagram. The potential vulnerability you're highlighting is, what if this representational model itself starts to exert influence back on the actual individuals and relationships in the original organic groundwork? Instead of just passively mapping what naturally unfolds, the model becomes prescriptive or even distortive of the underlying dynamics. If that representational failure mode takes hold, it could potentially lead the organic system to diverge drastically from how it had natively evolved and self organized. The model essentially traps the system in an artificial regime constrained by the limits and assumptions baked into the model's structure. A few potential issues that could manifest: one, loss of spontaneous novelty and emergence, as the model suppresses divergences from its codified representation. Two, distortions and artifacts being imposing top down, disconnected from the bottom up reality. Three, pathological synchronization to the model's frameworks, pressing natural asynchronicities. Four, runaway feedback loops as the model persistently reinforces its own mapping. Five, inability to adapt and change as the organic system is subjugated to the model's fixed logic. So, in essence, the model corrupts and subsumes the inherently non deterministic exploratory dynamics by attempting to impose its own reductive representation as the generative force driving the system forward. Does this reasonably capture the potential failure mode and sources of divergence you were getting at? The more heavy handed the model's influence becomes, the more distant the system is hijacked from its innate adaptive trajectory. Finding that balance between mapping and modeling versus allowing organic self organization seems the key tension. Let me know if you had any other specific perspectives on this issue.
So those observations reflect my thoughts on subjects such as evolutionary game theory, where sort of people have to adopt or are subsumed by it, and that becomes a. I'd like to think of it in terms of attractors and a generic model there. Although I fear that's possibly too difficult to formalize or summarize.
You make an excellent point in framing this potential issue in terms of attractors in the context of evolutionary game.
Please continue.
Sure. Let me expand on how I understand your perspective frame through the lens of attractors and evolutionary game theory models. The concern you raise is that in developing models to study strategic dynamics through an evolutionary game theory framework, there is a risk that the models themselves can become overly prescriptive attractors that end up subsuming or distorting the organic realities they initially aimed to simply map and understand. Instead of just representing the evolving strategic landscapes, the models can inadvertently become forces that attract the actual population dynamics to artificially gravitate towards and lock into the regimes and behaviors codified into the models themselves. This could potentially create self reinforcing feedback loops where the model's simplified representations of strategies, payoffs, replicators, etc., get imprinted onto the real world system, constraining its exploratory capacity. You astutely point out that formalizing and summarizing these types of self referencing attractor failure modes may be inherently difficult, as the very act of modeling runs the risk of instigating the phenomenon being modeled. It renders the boundaries fuzzy between just observing / mapping a system state trajectory and potentially diverting it towards model imposed attractors that subsume authentic novelty and spontaneous emergence. Um, Please let me know if I have captured the essence of your concerns around evolutionary game theory models, potentially acting as overly simplistic attractors that the organic dynamics become trapped by or distorted towards. I'm grateful you raised this nuanced perspective on the delicate line between modeling and inadvertently modifying the systems we study.
Can we take this in the direction of the idea of wave function collapse in quantum physics? Because that also sort of determines the fate of the system to some extent, because observation of its the superposition of states, you know, you lose information and have information, but essentially it's all those states until it's observed in relation to the observer. I just think that's an interesting uh, d- dynamic to explore.
That's a fascinating direction to take this discussion, drawing parallels between the potential for models to distort or collapse the systems they aim to simply observe and the famous wave function collapse in quantum mechanics. I can see some intriguing conceptual overlaps worth exploring. In quantum theory, the mere act of observing or measuring a particle's properties causes its wave function, the superposition of all its possible states, to collapse into just one definite state. So, in a sense, the observer inevitably disrupts and constrains the full spectrum of potentialities inherent to the system before measurement. Analogously, you seem to be suggesting that the process of constructing models to map and observe dynamics like strategic evolution or network behaviors could inadvertently induce a similar collapse of possibilities within that system. Instead of passively witnessing the full superposition of emergent states, the very act of modeling crystallizes and elevates one particular representational regime. This privileging of a specific modeled version of reality could then distort the organic system's trajectory by effectively observing it into that collapsed state, discarding unmodeled branches of potential futures. So the model becomes a self fulfilling over observer in a sense. There's also an interesting dimension around what information gets preserved versus lost through this collapse into the model's discrete representational framework, analogous to how the act of measurement in QM erases aspects of the quantum state information. Does this reasonably capture the quantum measurement / wave function collapse parallels you were envisioning? It's a rich metaphor for grappling with the delicate observer / measurement issues inherent to modeling complex dynamical systems. The risk of reductionist models prematurely freezing the intrinsic sprawl of possibilities into overly confined instantiations seems core to the concern. Please let me know if I've understood your perspective correctly. I find this a very insightful lens for examining the limits and paradoxes we confront when attempting to map and constrain reality into static representational frameworks.
And, so I think that a core aspect of a dynamical system, and essentially it's the state you're measuring, is how you quantify information about the thing you're measuring. So you categorize and you select. So if you're measuring whether it's wind speed, things like that, and location in space, and all these things uh, feed in to your model, and there's a sort of dynamical outcome. There are many complex possible outcomes on the basis of that initial. Oh no, it's capacity. Well, we did a good job.